From the beautiful mountains of western North Carolina, just outside the Blue Ridge Parkway, under the stars and around our mysterious blue planet, I'm your host, Jeremiah Greer, and you are listening to Shadows in the Dark.
Shadows in the Dark.
I'd like to welcome everyone to the show tonight. I believe we have a really exciting show with a special guest. First off, want to mention a few things. We do have our chat room going. All you have to do is go to www.shadowsinthedarkradio.com. There on the home page, you will see a big red button that says Join Our Chat Room. So feel free to join along, chat along with us as we go throughout the show. Also, we have our new poll running. Just beside that big red button, you'll see another big red button that says Participate in our weekly poll. This poll this week, we have kind of focusing on the Haiti UFO video. So we want your opinion on that. Just click on that red button, and we'll take you where you can fill out a questionnaire. And really, we're just asking, do you feel it's a UFO, alien UFO that is, or is it a military craft, or do you believe the video is just fake overall? So if you'll get in there, give us your opinion on it, and this Sunday we will reveal the results of that, just like we did our last show. We revealed the results for our last poll. So make sure and do that, kind of participate along with the show, keep things going along here. Also, if you wish, you can call into the show tonight. We are accepting a few calls, and our number is 718-508-9887. That's 718-508-9887. And just to let you know, give us a little bit of time to get the show rolling. A few shows we have had people call right off the bat, so you got to give us a little time. And when you do call in, make sure to either turn your speakers off or turn it down. That way it doesn't have an echo, because there is a slight delay in the show and actually when it's broadcast. It's about a 3-4 second delay, so make sure to turn that down, or you're going to kind of get yourself confused. We'll hear an echo in the background. So if you want to, that number again, 718-508-9887. And like I said, we've got what I feel a very special guest tonight. So we're going to be back in just a second with our guest, Michael Cremo. All right, Dr. Michael Cremo is a world-renowned expert in archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity and alternative theories of human origins. He has presented papers on his work at leading scientific institutions and scientific conferences organized by leading archaeological societies. He has also spoken at many of the world's leading universities. After receiving a scholarship to study international affairs at George Washington University, Michael began to study the ancient histories of India known as the Vedas. In this way, he has broadened his academic knowledge with spirituality from the Eastern tradition. Michael, welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you and all your listeners.
All right, I'm so glad you could join us. And like I said, I believe this is some, to me, very interesting topics to get into, talking about the human origin, and some of this forbidden archaeology. So if we could start off, and could you explain exactly what forbidden archaeology means compared to just archaeology itself?
Well, if we look at archaeology as kind of being like a big museum, we would find that people are only let into one tiny small room of that museum, and there they only see the stones and bones that go along with the current dominant theory of human origins, which is the Darwinian theory of human evolution. And according to that theory, humans like us came into existence only about 100,000 or 200,000 years ago, having evolved from more primitive ape-like ancestors. But what I've tried to show is that there are other rooms to that big museum of archaeology, rooms with intellectual locks on the doors, we might call them. And what I've tried to do is take those intellectual locks off the doors and let people in and see what else is there in that big museum of archaeology. And what we find are numerous archaeological discoveries in the form of human skeletons, human artifacts, and human footprints going back tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of years, right back to the very beginnings of the history of life on Earth. Now, this evidence isn't very well known because of what I call a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of archaeology. But that's what I'm talking about when I speak of forbidden archaeology. I mean the discoveries of human bones, human artifacts, and human footprints that radically contradict the current Darwinian theory of human origins.
Now, you say knowledge filtration. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that evidence that goes along with the current theories of human origins is very well known. People will read about this in their textbooks at high school or university. They will see scientists talking about this evidence on television programs that you see all the time. And if they go to the local museum of natural history, they will see these artifacts and bones and things like that, the ones that go along with the current theories. But there is another whole category of evidence that is filtered out because it contradicts the current theories of human origins. Now, the scientific knowledge filter may or may not be a deliberate conspiracy to suppress truth, but the effect is the same as if it were. Say if a scientist just looks at some evidence, say one of these reports of a human skeleton, like the human bones and human artifacts found in the California gold mines, which were 50 million years old, and a scientist looks at that and decides, well, that really can't be true. Something's got to be wrong with that evidence. I don't know what exactly, but it's so contradictory to everything that we know, from the established scientific point of view about human origins, that it has to be wrong. And therefore, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to mention it in my textbooks. I'm not going to talk about it with my colleagues. Mm-hmm. Now, that scientist, he doesn't think he's concealing true facts, which, if known, would cause people to disbelieve his theories and so on and so forth. But the effect is exactly the same as if it were. So that's what I mean by knowledge filtration. It's sort of something that's rooted very deeply in human nature. For example, if I love somebody and then somebody tells me something bad about the person I love, I don't want to believe it. I may even become angry at the person who tells me, not my girlfriend, not my wife or whatever. So it's something that's part of human nature. It's also part of the scientific process. It's a phenomenon that's very well understood by people who have studied how science works. Philosophers of science, historians of science, they all know that the way evidence is treated is often determined by theoretical preconceptions. In other words, what you think is true is going to determine how you look at evidence, how you evaluate it.
Right. All right. Well, now you wrote many books on the subject, and one of them is human de-evolution. Can you explain what exactly de-evolution is?
That book, Human Devolution, was a response to the questions readers began to ask me after they read my first book, Forbidden Archaeology. Now, in Forbidden Archaeology, I simply presented archaeological evidence that contradicts, the current theories of human origins. For example, these California gold mine discoveries where miners found human bones and human artifacts and layers of rock 50 million years old. They were reported to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney in a report published by Harvard University, but we don't hear about these discoveries anymore today because of this knowledge filtering process. So in that book, Forbidden Archaeology, I presented hundreds of cases like that from the scientific literature of reports of human bones, human footprints, and human artifacts going back tens of millions of years. So then after people read that book, they began to ask me, well, if you're presenting all this evidence that contradicts the current theories of human origins, the current evolutionary theory, then what are you going to propose in its place? So this book, Human Devolution, is my reply to that. And basically, what I'm proposing in that book is that we don't evolve up from matter, as most scientists now believe. Rather, we devolve or come down from a level of pure consciousness in the cosmos. Now, this is an idea I got from my studies of the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, and therefore I call the book a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. But I understand that this Vedic alternative is part of a larger family of spiritual alternatives to Darwinism with roots in practically all of the world's great spiritual traditions. So you could say what I'm presenting in this book is the common heritage of human wisdom down through the ages, namely that we're not just a combination of chemicals. There's something more to the human essence than that. There's something that goes beyond matter. There is pure consciousness or spirit, if you like that word, and I'm proposing that's our origin. We didn't come up from matter, but down from spirit. And what I proposed is that before we even ask the question, where did human beings come from, we should first of all ask the question, what is a human being? Now, as I said, many scientists are going to say, you or me or any of your listeners, you're just a combination of chemicals, a very complex organization of chemicals, and that's all there is to it. And what we call consciousness and love and all this stuff, that is just a temporary byproduct of bioelectrical activity in the brain, and that's all there is to it. You just disorganize the chemicals, and there is no such thing as consciousness or mind or any of that. So what I'm proposing is no, if we actually look at all the evidence that comes to us from different fields of scientific investigation, we're going to see that a human being is more than just a combination of matter. Matter, that's part of what a human being is, but beyond that, there is a subtle mind element with some very unusual powers like extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. And beyond that, there is a conscious self that can exist completely apart from the body. And when I speak of consciousness and mind, I'm not just talking about the temporary byproducts of bioelectrical activity in the brain. I'm talking about them as separate substances that exist on their own, just like gold is an element, silver is an element. So consciousness is like an element or a substance. Mind is an element or a substance. They have their own independent existence apart from the chemicals that make up part of what a human being is. Right. So what I'm proposing is that we begin on the level of pure consciousness and devolve from there. The conscious self becomes covered by mind and matter. So that's what I mean by devolution.
Okay, so what would, if you propose that we started off as pure consciousness, what would have caused us to, I guess, kind of saying travel backwards?
That is a question practically everyone has. And here's how I answer that question. I mean, one thing we notice about consciousness, it's individual and it's personal. I have my consciousness. You have your consciousness. Each of your listeners has his or her individual consciousness. Now, one thing we therefore notice about consciousness is that it's individual and personal. And to me, that suggests the source of all conscious beings is also individual and personal. So when I speak about this original state of pure consciousness, I don't mean something that's just like a shining white light. I'm talking more about a society of pure beings, of consciousness that exist in loving harmony with each other and with the source of all conscious beings. So there's something that can disturb that harmony, and that is when a particular conscious self decides to become selfish, to put more emphasis on his or her own selfish desires, and that disturbs the harmony of that original society of beings of pure consciousness or spirit. And when that happens, that the conscious self has to go somewhere else, because it can no longer exist in that state of loving, harmonious relationships. So one thing about love is it has to be freely given. That means you have to have the freedom to love or not love, to love yourself more than others or not love yourself more than others. So that freedom always has to be there. It's a part of our essential being as conscious selves. So the reason why we devolve is because we exercise that freedom that each conscious self has as a part of its nature to love or not love. So when we choose to become selfish instead of loving, that is the cause of our devolution into this world of mind and matter where we find ourselves in competition with other selves who have made that same decision to become selfish. And then we have a choice to make. We can either try to restore ourselves to that original state of pure consciousness where we exist in loving harmony with all other conscious beings and with the source of all conscious beings, or we can entangle ourselves more and more deeply in selfish competition with other conscious selves in the realm of matter.
Now, mentioning that, I mean, you look around, I mean, obviously the world is, at least on the surface, it looks like it's very selfish. Do you feel that we're still devolving, or is there some point where it has turned around, where we are going back to this pure consciousness, or we can do this?
I think it's a decision each conscious self has to make. I think we can look around ourselves and we can see, yes, that there are those who are traveling towards the light, who are traveling in that direction, who are making conscious decisions every day to put love for others, love for the source of all conscious beings above their love for their personal self. So we can see that every day, and we can see that there are people who are making the opposite kinds of decisions, who are becoming more and more deeply involved in selfishness, individually and collectively. And I think this is the ultimate cause of a lot of the conflict that we see in the world that goes on an individual level and a collective level. So I think, yes, there are people who are moving in the right direction, and there are people who are moving in the wrong direction. And even within each of us ourselves, we've got different tendencies. There's a tendency to want to restore ourselves to the original position of living in harmony with all other conscious beings. I think that's what we would want. I think it's what everyone would want, is to be able to live in peaceful, loving harmony with all other living things. But we also have another tendency in ourselves, that tendency to put oneself first above all others, and to, instead of sacrifice one's own desires for those of others, to want to dominate, exploit, control, compete, and we see where those different paths lead. So I think it's up to each individual self to make the decision where they're going to situate themselves in terms of this development, to engage in what I call re-evolution, restoring the conscious self to its original pure state, or remaining entangled in the coverings of the self and the different selfish desires that arise from that.
when most people think of pure consciousness, or you say spirit, they don't really see anything, I guess, that it would be tangible that you can touch. So how does that tie in with archaeology and the evidence of our origin?
Well, when we look at the great wisdom traditions of the world, they have always said that human beings have been around since the very beginning of the history of life on Earth, and that we didn't originate here. We came from some higher level of being, ultimately, through what some people call a fall, through what some people like me would call a devolution, or some would call a journey from some other dimension. All the great wisdom traditions of the world, if you look at them, they say that. Now, on the other hand, our modern scientific worldview is telling us, well, that's all mythology. And basically, there's no such thing as any world of pure consciousness or spirit. There's only the world of matter. And they would say, if we want to explain life and consciousness, well, consciousness means long time ago some chemicals combined together in the Earth's early ocean. They formed the first living thing just as a purely piece of molecular machinery. And that piece of molecular machinery gradually evolved until you get to the human state. And in that human state, the molecules in the brain combine together in very complex ways to produce consciousness. And then as soon as you die, or the chemicals become disorganized, there's no more consciousness, no more love, emotion, all of that stuff. So the very first thing that I thought it was necessary to do was to show people that this materialistic concept of the origin of human beings and life and consciousness is wrong. And one way that I found it's possible to do that is to look at the fossil evidence. And, for example, like when we look through the scientific literature of the past 150 years, from the time of Darwin to the present, we see that there's a lot of archaeological evidence that contradicts the current Darwinian theories of human origins. And, for example, there was a scientific journal called The Geologist, and in the year 1862 published a very interesting report. A human skeleton, like that of a human being like ourselves, not any kind of an ape man, was found 90 feet below the surface of the ground in Macoupin County, Illinois. And according to the report in this scientific journal, directly above the skeleton was a thick layer of slate rock, which was unbroken. And that's very important that it was unbroken, because that rules out the possibility that the skeleton could have come down from some higher, more recent level through some kind of fissure or earth movement or something like that.
Yeah.
So geologists from the state of Illinois told us that the layer of rock below the slate rock at this particular place in Macoupin County was about 300 million years old. That's from before the time of the dinosaurs even. So you have reports like this. You have a report from Scientific American telling of a beautiful metallic vase that was found 15 feet deep in solid rock near Boston. And according to modern geological reporting, the age of the formation there is about 600 million years old, which is about the time that scientists say that life first came onto the land, came onto Earth, the Earth part, from the water. But it's a beautiful metallic vase with silver inlaid floral patterns on it. It was found solidly embedded in rock, 600 million years old. So you've got just hundreds of these cases. My book, Forbidden Archaeology, is about 900 pages long, and it's full of hundreds of these reports from the time of Darwin all the way up to the present, of discoveries of archaeological evidence showing that human beings have been around, not just for the 100,000 or 200,000 years that most scientists now believe possible, but they were present 5 million years ago, 10 million years ago, 100 million years ago, 500 million years ago, going all the way back to the very beginning of the history of life on Earth. So when you consider that, that means you have to start thinking about some alternative explanations for human origins. And the kinds of things, the kinds of alternatives that I think need to be considered involve going beyond matter. Because as I said, most scientists think, well, a human being is just a combination of chemicals, but I think there's more to it than that. There's a subtle mind element that has some very unusual powers that some scientists have studied. For example, every physics student learns about the work of Marie and Pierre Curie. You know, they were husband and wife. They lived in Paris, France, early in the 20th century. They both got Nobel Prizes for their work in discovering radium. In any high school textbook, you'll find that. Like Marie Curie, she's like a saint of science, kind of like a Mother Teresa of science or something like that.
All right.
Very, very, very popular because she was a famous woman scientist in particular. But what you don't read in your physics textbook or your high school science textbook is that Marie and Pierre Curie were heavily involved in psychical research into the paranormal. They were part of a group of 20 prominent European scientists, including 5 Nobel Prize winners, including themselves, that were involved in this research early in the 20th century in Paris. And this group of scientists did 2 years of research with a medium, an Italian medium named Eusebia Palladino. And these experiments took place not in somebody's dark living room, which is the usual sort of preconception that people have. These experiments took place in the Psychology Institute in Paris under carefully controlled conditions in broad daylight. And in these experiments, the scientists carefully controlled the medium. On one occasion, like Marie Curie was holding her hands, other scientists were holding her feet in this laboratory. And in the lab, in broad daylight, Pierre Curie, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said he saw a large table float about 3 feet off the ground and remain there for a long time, floating in midair. So he was, timing how long it was floating in the air. He was measuring very carefully how high it was floating in the air. You can consult his research notes, which are still in the science archives in Paris. And he's saying this happened under perfectly controlled conditions, under perfect conditions for observation. And after 2 years of these experiments, the entire group of scientists signed a document saying these phenomena were true. And Pierre Curie wrote letters to his prominent scientific friends saying these things are absolutely true, and we have to take them into account, if we're going to have, a complete picture of reality. So you can see it starts leading away from the stones and the bones. The archaeological discoveries just show that we need a new explanation for human origins, and then that leads into many, many other different aspects. Because, as I said, I think the first thing is, if we're going to talk about where did human beings come from, let's first of all decide what a human being is. Because, as I said, some scientists are going to say we're just a combination of chemicals, but I think there's more to it than that. I think there's a subtle mind element associated with the human organism that can act in some very unusual ways that we can't explain by our current laws of physics. And some people are going to say, well, that's not very scientific, but I just gave the example of 2 of the most famous scientists in the history of science, Pierre and Marie Curie, who were actively investigating these things, and they were saying it was true. They had what they regarded as really good evidence for psychokinesis, the ability of mind to move matter. And as I mentioned a little earlier, this mind element, this subtle mind element associated with the human organism, has some other powers as well, such as extrasensory perception. For over 10 years, there have been some very interesting experiments going on in some universities in Europe, in particular in the United Kingdom, like the University of Edinburgh and the University of Amsterdam, where they have actually had chairs of parapsychology that are part of the university. They have professors who are professors of parapsychology in these universities. So they've done experiments on extrasensory perception called the Gonsfeld extrasensory perception experiments. And in these experiments, one person called a receiver is put into a very relaxed state, a state of mild sensory deprivation. And meanwhile, at another location, a second person called a sender looks at an image randomly selected by a computer and then mentally tries to send that image to the receiver. And at the end of each trial, the receiver is shown 4 images, one of which is the actual target image. Mm-hmm. Now, if you run the experiment hundreds of thousands of times, which has been done, and you assume there's nothing paranormal going on, then you would expect that the receivers would pick the correct image 1 time out of 4, 25% of the time. But in actual fact, when you add up all the experimental results, the experimenters have found that the receivers pick the correct image at a rate much greater than 25% of the time. Actually, they pick it correctly at a rate billions of times greater than what you could expect by chance. So
now I've seen them do stuff like that with twins, exact same test, and their rate of success was like around 70 to 80%.
Yeah, it's just fantastic. So you've got some evidence. If we're going to talk about human origins, we can't just talk about the chemicals. We got to talk about this subtle mind element with its very unusual powers. Then even beyond that, there's some scientific evidence for a conscious self that can exist completely apart from the body, apart from the mind. And this evidence comes from, for example, psychiatric studies of past life memories. The work of Dr. Ian Stevenson, who died recently, was really supporting this idea. He and his colleagues from University of Virginia Medical School investigated thousands of cases of past life memories reported by young children. And in 800 of these cases, over 800 of these cases, the investigators found they were able to verify the existence of the person the child claimed to have been in the past life, which means you have the idea of a conscious self that can transfer from one physical body to another and retain its memories of the previous incarnation. And this idea is also supported by medical studies of out-of-body experiences, where typically during a heart attack or some other serious traumatic kind of injury, at a time when a person should be completely unconscious, the person will report separating from the body and being able to look down and observe what the doctors and nurses trying to revive them are doing. And several physicians in different countries have carefully studied this phenomenon, and they've determined that these people aren't just making it up. They've compared what these people say they observed with the actual medical records kept by the doctors and nurses treating them. They found the descriptions match. The descriptions of what these people say they saw when they were looking down at their own bodies, at the doctors and nurses and what they were doing. Their descriptions match the descriptions given by the doctors and nurses themselves. And the patients, they don't see these detailed medical records. So if we're going to talk about human origins, then I think we have to talk not just about the chemicals, we also have to talk about this subtle mind element and also this evidence for a conscious self that can exist apart from the body and apart from the mind. So that takes you into another whole dimension. I think it leads to the idea that we exist in a multi-level cosmos, where we have one level of the cosmos dominated by ordinary matter and inhabited by beings adapted to the conditions there. I think that's where we find ourselves now. Then beyond that, there is a level of the cosmos dominated by the subtle mind element and inhabited by beings adapted to the conditions there. And down through the ages, people have had different names for these beings. They've called them gods, goddesses, astral beings, ETs, angels. There's a lot of different names for them. And then beyond that, there's the realm of pure consciousness or spirit. So what I'm proposing is that we begin our existence on that level of pure consciousness. If we depart from that level, we may drift down to the level of the subtle mind element, where the conscious self will be covered by the subtle mental energies, and we may exist there on that level. Or we may drift further down to the level of ordinary matter and receive a covering not only of mind, but of the physical substance of the body, a material body made of the chemical elements. And this isn't so hard to understand. Just like we know that as human beings, we're normally meant to exist on the land, but if we want to exist in a foreign element like underwater for more than just a few seconds, then we have to have some kind of vehicle, like a submarine or a diving suit, that will allow us to function in that alien element. So when the being of pure consciousness comes down to this level of matter, it needs a vehicle in which to function at this level. And those vehicles are what we call bodies. Bodies are vehicles for conscious selves. And the vehicles are manufactured by beings higher than us in this cosmic hierarchy of beings that I've outlined.
Let me remind our listeners that we do have our chat room going. If you want to jump in there, ask some questions, just go to shadowsinthedarkradio.com. That's all one word. And now, Michael, we did have one question from the chat room from Sky, and she was asking, does any of this relate to the December 21st, 2012? Everybody knows that from the Mayan calendar.
Well, the Mayan calendar is very, very interesting, for one thing, because it deals with huge cycles of time lasting many millions of years. So the Mayan calendar was developed because the Mayans believed that humans had been around for many, many millions of years. So that goes along with the archaeological evidence that I talk about in my book, Forbidden Archaeology. And this idea that time goes in cycles is something that many cultures and traditions have had. The Vedic tradition of India also has this idea that time goes in cycles, and there are cycles of creations and destructions. Plato and Aristotle and the old Greek and Roman philosophers also had this idea that time goes in vast cycles. So the Mayans also had this idea. And in these ideas, which are different from the modern scientific concept of time, which is linear, more linear and progressive, in these cyclical concepts of time, there are usually periodic catastrophes that happen from time to time, after which human civilization has to be revived, the earth has to be repopulated, and things like that. So that is something that all these cyclical concepts of time have. Now, in terms of the Mayan calendar, there are different theories about what that 2012 means, whether it will be the beginning of some new age of light or whether there will be some big catastrophe at that time. There are some who say there's some astronomical correlation, like with the Earth's solar system passing through the plane of our galaxy. Like if you made like a line that went across the center of our Milky Way galaxy. The Earth would be crossing, the solar system would be crossing that plane in 2012. So I think we're just going to have to wait to see. According to the time cycles as they're described in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, the next big catastrophe comes at the end of what's called the Kali Yuga, which would be about 400,000 years from now. So I think we'll just have to see what happens in 2012. Some people are predicting some kind of major catastrophe. Some are predicting some big upsurge in spirituality at that time, according to how they read, the Mayan calendar and the ideas associated with it. I guess it would be good to ask the Mayan people themselves what they think about it. But from the standpoint of other systems of cyclical time, such as the Vedic time cycles, there doesn't appear to be anything special about the year 2012. So we'll just have to see what happens.
My kind of thought on it is, not to sound, sarcastic about it or trying to be funny about it, but who's to say it's just where they didn't decide to stop? I mean, I hand you a 2007 calendar, you're going to assume that December 31st, 2007 is the end of the world. I mean, you never know. Like you say, you've got to wait till 2012 to see exactly what happens with that. But a big question, a lot of people.
I'm not expecting a big disaster myself, but
right.
We'll see.
I mean, obviously nobody can make a calendar that continues for eternity. You have to stop at some point. But now, with what being said on human origins and your theories behind them, what you've proposed of where our origin is, what's happening, how we're devolving, what kind of reaction have you gotten from the scientific community? I mean, this obviously kind of rubs against what we're taught every day in the school systems.
Well, it's very interesting because what I found is that the scientific world is not monolithic. There are lots of different kinds of people within the scientific world. It's very amazing. There are some which I would call the fundamentalist materialists, who are very much opposed to the kind of thing that I'm saying. They don't want to hear it. They don't want anybody else to hear it. There's another group that's a little more open-minded, in that they may, at least on the surface, look like they're supporters of the current materialistic, reductionistic, theories of the origin of life and the origin of the human species. But I think they're different from this other group in the sense that the first group, which I call the fundamentalist materialist, I think they hold on to these materialistic scientific ideas for reasons that go beyond just science. I think it's an ideology with them. It's kind of religion with them. It's kind of like a party line sort of thing with them. Whereas this other group, although they may be supporters of the Darwinian theory of evolution, I think they're supporters of that theory for more or less scientific reasons because it just makes sense to them. But they're willing to listen to new ideas and modify their what they believe. So in that group, I mean, for example, when my book Human Devolution first came out, it came into the hands of an anthropologist at a university on the East Coast, and he read the book and he wrote to me and he said, I would like to invite you to come and give a major lecture at a conference organized by a division of the American Anthropological Association, which is the main organization of professional anthropologists in the United States. So they invited me to this conference, and they gave me 2 hours to make a presentation about the book at this conference, a scientific conference at a major university. So it was really pretty amazing. It was the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness. So it was really pretty amazing. And I've been invited to universities, not just in this country, but in other countries. Like there's the biggest university in Bali in Indonesia. They invited me to come there and give a 2-hour presentation about the book to their whole university faculty and student body. It was really pretty amazing.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not that the world of science is completely monolithic, and we have to realize that science, the is changing, and I think it's moving in at least some part of it's moving in a direction that's very favorable to the kinds of ideas that I'm talking about. And we also have to understand that scientists are people, and there are young scientists and old scientists. I mean, sometimes when people hear the word scientist, they think it must be some older person, 50 or 60 years old, with a mustache and a suit and a tie and very conservative.
Big white beard.
Like that. Sort of that sort of type person, very straight-laced. But there are 20 and 30-year-old people now who are scientists and professors at universities who grew up they grew up with the X-Files, and they grew up listening to radio shows like yours and things like that. So although they may be scientists and professors, at universities, they don't fit, the stereotype that many people have of what a scientist is. I remember a couple of years ago, I was invited by a professor of geology at a university in one of the oil-producing states here in America, and he invited me to come and speak to the geology department. The geology department at this school is like a huge department. They have the biggest, most modern building on campus, and all the geology professors and graduate students of geology came to hear me talk. And later I asked this professor, well, why did you invite me, to talk? How did you learn about my work? He said, well, I was listening. I heard you talk on the Art Bell radio show, which is sort of one of the radio shows in the genre that you're also in.
Right. I mean,
so you would, you wouldn't think, well, like, here's this science professor at a big university, he's up late at night listening to alternative scientific ideas. So it's what I found is it's very unusual. It's very, it's not as many people think that the world of science is totally monolithic. There is that element that is very much opposed to the kind of things that you probably talk about on this show and that I talk about in my work and write about in my books. But there are some scientists who are a little bit open to these things. Some are more open than others. I can recall once I was invited to give a lecture at the physics department of a university in Europe, and the audience was about 100 physics professors and graduate students of physics. And I went through what I call the hidden history of physics. I mentioned cases like the one I did on the show here a little bit earlier this evening about the Marie and Pierre Curie doing psychical research, and I went through other cases of prominent physicists who've done that kind of research. So I was wondering, well, what are they going to say? Because it was a department of nuclear physics, at a big European university, a science university. And I was wondering, well, what are they going to say? So afterwards, one of the physics professors came up to me and he said, well, I'm very glad that you gave this talk. He said, by day I'm doing plasma physics. That's the physics of superheated gases. But he said, at night, privately, I'm doing some experiments in telepathy with my son. He said, I put my son in another room and I flip a coin, and my son's got to tell me whether it's heads or tails. He said, my son is getting 80% correct. And he said, I wouldn't tell this to any of my colleagues, at the university because they think I'm crazy, but he felt safe about talking to me about it. And I thought, well, that's very interesting because you've got somebody that, from the external point of view, looks like a totally ordinary scientist, very orthodox in his views, but privately, he's got some other idea. So there have been a variety of responses to my work from the scientific world. Some of them, they hate it. They don't want to hear it. They don't want anybody else to hear it. Some of them, they may not agree with me, but they're willing to listen, which I think is an important first step, because if ideas are going to change, the very first thing is that scientists have to be willing to listen to alternatives. And among those who do listen, there are some who actually agree with me. Now, they would be in the minority at this point, but that's how these things go. It's one reason why I have some respect even though I'm not a supporter of the theory of evolution, I have some respect for Charles Darwin and his early followers, because at a time when nobody accepted their ideas, they had the courage to stand up and say, well, this is what we think.
Mm-hmm. Now, with the, like you mentioned earlier, with the younger generation growing up with things like the X-Files and, of course, Art Bell and George Norrie, you've really got to have a lot of respect for them people.
And you too.
So, it's for ones that do things like this to help get this word out of that, maybe history is not exactly as it says, or that there's more to life than what we think. I mean, do you foresee that in the maybe near future that the books taught in school will start changing to more adapt to, say, the concepts of human origin like we're talking about tonight?
Well, I would hope so. I think I think a lot of people would like to see that. There's tremendous resistance to it from this very vocal, fundamentalist, materialist element within the scientific world. And somehow or other, they've managed to get the government on their side. They've managed to get the court system on their side, so that whenever somebody does propose some alternative, be taught in the school system, then through their relationship with the government, they manage to get it suppressed. And I think this is something that we've really got to look at in a democratic society. I mean, there was a philosopher of science who, a few years ago, named Paul Feyerabend, who had this idea that just like in our society we separate church and state, we should also separate science and state. Mm-hmm. And we should recognize that, there are other ways of looking at the world than kind of like the standard materialistic scientific worldview. And in a democratic society, these views should also be represented. If you look at the Gallup surveys, over 40 to 50% of the American people have claimed to have had some kind of paranormal experience or some kind of experience with UFOs. Either they believe in them or they've actually observed them. Over 80% of the people don't accept the Darwinian theory of evolution as it is taught in the school systems. And even within the scientific world, there are people who do not accept the Darwinian theory of evolution. I don't accept it, and I present these ideas at scientific conferences, at universities, and at leading scientific institutions like the Royal Institution in London, the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. So it's not true that in the scientific world there's only one opinion about these things. So what I think needs to be done, because normally I don't think we would tolerate our government telling us you can only listen to one radio station, or you can only watch one television station, or buy one kind of car, read one newspaper. But we're somehow or other in this country, we're now tolerating our government telling us that our children in our schools can only be taught one idea about human origins. And it happens to be a point of view that most people in this country don't accept. So I think at a certain point that even though up to this point these fundamentalist materialists have been able to influence our government through its judicial system to keep their views intact, I think at a certain point our government representatives it's going to click with them that they shouldn't be doing that. It'd be like saying you can only vote for one political party or watch one television station or something. At a certain point, I think they're going to understand that the proper thing to do is this, to say, all right, in the school system, okay, today most scientists believe this theory or that theory, but there are others who have some other idea, and here's what they say. And I would say it should be proportional. Let's admit, okay, most scientists accept the Darwinian theory of evolution, the idea that life came from chemicals and all that stuff. So let them have most of the time in the classroom, let them have most of the textbook pages, but then there should be some time in the classroom and some number of textbook pages that are devoted to presenting alternative ideas neutrally, not as they sometimes do now, as saying, well, yes, well, scientists, we believe this, and there's some few crazy people who believe in UFOs and paranormal stuff like that.
Right.
They're all crazy. But no, present it. All right, here's what most scientists now believe about the origin of life and the universe and things like that. And then have some part of the classroom time and some part of the textbook, small part, I would say in the beginning, just to say, okay, but there are some alternative ideas, and here's what they are. Just present it neutrally, not putting it down, and then let the students make up their own minds about it. I think if that were done, then I think gradually we would see big changes in the scientific world.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And
because it's like, say, like if you have, say, like a small political party, maybe an environmental party or something like that. Well, they're not going to become the majority party, but I can vote for them because I like their ideas, something like that. Well, great. But what if that party was outlawed? Then you couldn't vote for it. It would be bad for your career. You'd get on some government watch list or something, So I think it's the same now in the education system. These other alternatives have been outlawed, and it kind of discourages, many people from really giving serious consideration to them. But I think if they were just, the alternatives were presented and then let people make up their own minds about it, I think that's the right way to work in a democratic society.
Well, Michael, we've got probably about a minute and a half, 2 minutes left, so why don't you let everybody know what websites they can visit that you have to get more information on this?
Well, my main website is mcremo.com, mcremo.com. It's got my travel schedule, upcoming media events, and things like that. Also, there's an opportunity to look at the books and purchase them there. There's also a website dedicated to human devolution, humandevolution.com, and there's also a forbiddenarchaeology.com dedicated to that specific book. But they could start with mcremo.com, mcremo.com.
Now, you've written 4 books, is that correct?
I've written 4 books on these scientific topics. One of them is Forbidden Archaeology, which is this archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity. There's the full unabridged version, which is 900 pages. There's also a shorter version, 300 pages, called The Hidden History of the Human Race. And then people would ask me, well, what's been the scientific reaction to your work? So I put together a whole book about that. It's called Forbidden Archaeology's Impact, which contains all the scientific reactions and my responses. And then people began asking me, well, if you're saying the Darwinian theory of evolution is wrong and you've got all this evidence that contradicts it, what are you going to put in its place? So that's the book, Human Devolution, a Vedic Alternative to Darwin's Theory. So those are my 4 books that I've got out now on this topic. And I'm working now on a book that I'm calling Forbidden Archaeology 2, which is more archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to that. And, Mike, I want to thank you for coming on the show. It was very interesting, thought-provoking. And, like you, I hope to see the changes in the schools to teach this alternative science. So, to get the children and even college students out there, thinking different ways about subjects like this.
Yes, I think that's very much needed because what we've got now is kind of a government-enforced intellectual monopoly for just one idea, which I think is opposed, both to the principles of science and democracy.
Yep, I agree. Well, Michael, again, and I hope you come back and join us sometime. I really enjoyed it.
I would love to do that.
All right. Thank you again for joining us.
Good night.
Good night. All right, everybody. That was Michael Cremo. Very fascinating stuff there about the human origin. Get you thinking a little bit about it there and exactly where you come from. Pure consciousness. That's his theory on it. So make sure and check out his website, mcremo.com. And again, I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank those who joined us in the chat room, especially to Qatar and Sky. Thank you for sticking around with us, chatting it up there in this chat room. Again, Michael Cremo was our guest. We appreciate him coming on. That's mcremo.com. And tune in this Sunday when our guest will be George Smart, when we'll talk about the Knights Templar and the Holy Grail. And you can visit our site at shadowsinthedarkradio.com. So again, thanks for listening, and always remember to be watchful of those shadows in the dark.